process in detail. Suppose take any object in the application. Here let us consider web edit or else web button. Okay. What are the properties available for this web button? There are a big list of properties. There's a huge list of properties for the web button or any object like X coordinate, Y coordinate, width, height, inner HTML, outer HTML. All these are properties of an object. Like you have features of any animal or any human being. Every object is having so many properties. Like visible, it's also one property. Enable, this is also a property. Similarly, text property. Similarly, class is also property of an object, and so on. It's a very big list. So during record time, if this object is stored in the repository, this entire property list should be saved. Similarly, in the application, there is not only a single object, there are many objects like web edits or else main window, whatever it is. Different objects will be there, and each object will be having such a big list of properties. So if QTP keep on storing all the property list for each and every object, the object repository size will not enough. At one point, the object repository will bloat. That's one disadvantage is if it keep on storing all the list of properties. And the other one is if it keep on storing the complete list of properties for each and every object, the script execution time increases drastically. Execution increases means testing process slows down. Means it takes much time for the script to execute. Because what happens during execution? It will go through line by line. It will go to the repository, fetch the object information, and it will compare it with the objects present in the application during runtime. So if it happens, it should fetch this big list of properties and it should compare this entire list with that of the objects in the application. If this happens, execution time increases because it need to compare each and every property value. So to avoid these problems, to overcome these problems, QTP will not store all the entire list of properties, but it will store only the selected properties which are called mandatory properties and assistive properties. What is meant by mandatory properties and what are the assistive properties? It will store only some selective properties which are classified as manual and assistive. Mandatory and assistive. Mandatory means the most fundamental properties of the object, like class property, means by changing which the original object will be changed itself. Means the most fundamental properties by which you can identify the object uniquely. Suppose take a button. The class property of the button is equal to web button if it is in the web environment, or else if it is a bin button if it is present in the Windows environment. So suppose it is changed and the class property is web edit. Is it anymore the same button? Because it's no more called a button, it's an edit box. So these are the most fundamental properties by changing which the original object itself will be changed. Such important properties are called mandatory properties, like class property. Second one is like some window ID which give unique identification. Right? So these are called mandatory properties, and assistive properties are nothing but second important properties. This is the first set of important properties, and these are some secondary important properties like visible property or else some height property, width property, and so on. In object repository, there will be default some mandatory properties and some assistive properties. And during record time, QTP will store only those mandatory and assistive properties, but it will not store the entire list of the properties whichever applicable for the object. So how it will store? Suppose there are by default, for every object class there will be default some object properties. Like if you see here, select the OK button or a cancel button. See here, you are seeing only two properties saved. One is text cancel and the other one native class equal to button. That's all, only two properties. But there are many properties for the button, but those are all properties are not saved. By default, there will be some mandatory properties and some assistive properties. So it will store only those things. Let us see where the default properties will be there. Go to tools menu. You see object identification. Select that. You see object identification window. Here you can see the two set of properties for each and every object. Like if you select here, first select the environment. If you want to see for Windows, select it and select the object class for which you want to see the mandatory and assistive. Here I am selecting the button, Win button. So the mandatory properties are native class and text, and assistive properties window ID. See, by default, some properties are chosen as mandatory and some properties are chosen as window assistive. By default, there were some properties stored. So if you again go to resources and see object repository, for a button, only these two properties are the ones which are saved. See again, resources, object repository. This is the button object. So you see only two properties, which is text and native class. Means whatever properties configured here, those properties will only be saved. Select the object class here and see the object properties which are by default given here. And also there is a chance that you can modify which properties you want to be as mandatory and which property you want to be as assistive. Suppose you feel that you want to add one more property as a mandatory. You just click on add or remove button, select the property here. Suppose I want a enabled property to be also mandatory. Select the particular, so here it shows the complete list of the properties available for that particular object class. For Win button, this is the complete list of properties. Out of the list, we are selecting some properties as a mandatory and some as assistive and configuring here. So select enabled, okay. So you have three properties which are called mandatory now. Now if you say okay, from the next time if you record, those three properties can be seen in the repository. Here it's already recorded, now you cannot see. So if you configure new properties, you add a new properties as a mandatory or assistive, those properties will be saved from the next time when you record. So that is how you'll be having some mandatory and assistive properties. So why there's a distinction? So what happens during record time? During record time, suppose you configured three properties as your mandatory and one property as your assistive. So during record time, what happens? It have to store the property values in the repository. So it will store, QTP will store all the mandatory properties by default. Suppose if QTP can recognize the object even with the first property itself. Suppose you are having an application and it has only two objects like a button and the other one is edit box. You have only two objects. So this has a class property web button and this has the class property web edit. So during storage, if you store this class property, that is enough because there are only two objects and each object class is having only one object. If you store only the class property, that is enough to identify the object. Means only storing one property is enough to recognize the object uniquely. But even then, It will store all the mandatory properties, means whichever mentioned as mandatory, all the properties will be stored by default. Whatever properties are mentioned as a mandatory in the object identification window, all those properties will be stored by default, even though QTP can identify with a single property. So these properties, all the properties will be stored. Next, coming to this assist2 properties. Assist2 properties will be stored only if required. Means after storing this mandatory properties, if QTP needs some more properties to uniquely identify the object. Suppose you give mandatory properties some very less important properties like height, width and visible. So if QTP thinks it cannot identify uniquely with these properties, it will go for the assist2 and it will store the first assist2 property. After storing the first assist2 property, if it still needs, it cannot uniquely identify the object, it will go for the second assist2 property if it is there, if it is provided. Then if it feels it can make identification, it will stop here. Otherwise, it will go for whatever number of properties available as assist2. Means assist2 properties will be stored only depending on the requirement. If it cannot identify the object with the provided mandatory properties, then it will go with the first assist2 property. Even after storing the first assist2 property, if QTP cannot identify the object, then only it will store the second one, then third one, and so on if there are some more assist2 properties. So there are again say 4 assist2 properties. So it stored the fourth property also. Then even after storing the assist2 fourth property, if QTP cannot still make unique identification, if QTP thinks these are not sufficient to make identification uniquely, but there are no more properties, no more assist2 properties, only 4 assist2 properties, then it will go for another property called ordinal identifiers, and it will store this property. That is about object identification. So that is how properties were stored. And during record time, during runtime, so it has stored, let us say it has stored some um, 3 mandatory properties and first assist2 property. That's all, first assist2 property. So totally 4 properties are there. So during runtime, without any distinction between mandatory and assist2, it will prepare the list of 4 properties and it will compare all the properties with that of the properties present for the object in the application. Suppose it's a button. So it will compare all the 4 properties of that stored in the repository with that of the object in the application. Suppose if any one single property mismatch, means say here text property equal to OK, but here let us say the text property is some sign in, then object identification fails and it will throw the error object cannot be identified. Means all the property values should be matched. Whatever property is stored, all the property values should be matched with that of the objects in the application during runtime. And the objects whichever present in the application during runtime are called runtime objects. And the objects whichever stored in the repository are called test objects. And test objects include the objects on which you have performed some operation. It does not include all the objects in the application, only objects on which you have performed some operations. Whereas runtime objects are all the objects including the objects which you don't perform the operations. So during runtime, it will compare the test object properties with that of the runtime object properties and it will uniquely identify the object. Suppose if object identification fails here, suppose there is any mismatch, then what happens? Then it will go for smart object identification.